Some women were silenced because their voices threatened order. Others were erased because erasure was more convenient than divorce. Bertha Mason was both. I am the archivist, and this is Ghost Lectures, Voices from Gothic Literature. Tonight's speaker requires reintroduction because the Bertha Mason preserved in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is frequently mischaracterized. She has been described as mad, as monstrous, as the Gothic obstacle that must be removed before the love story can reach its conclusion. But the historical pattern suggests something else. The surviving record describes the following. Bertha Mason was born in Jamaica, daughter of a colonial planter. She married Edward Rochester in a transaction that secured property and social position for both families. She was brought to England. After her condition deteriorated, she was eventually confined to the upper floor of Thornfield Hall. Rochester's account, the only account preserved in the primary text, claims hereditary madness, claims the diagnosis preceded confinement, claims he had no choice. But contemporary records of Victorian confinement reveal a different pattern. The 1845 Lunacy Act formalized the asylum system, creating legal frameworks for institutional confinement. But private confinement, the domestic attic, the locked room, operated without oversight. A husband could confine his wife indefinitely. Authority would be invoked afterward to provide medical justification. The certificate became retroactive authorization. The cage came first. The label came after. For women, the threshold for diagnosis was breathtakingly low. Excessive emotion, defiance of a husband's authority, sexual impropriety or the accusation of it, religious enthusiasm, intellectual ambition. These were not symptoms, they were inconveniences. But once a woman was declared mad, she lost everything. Legal rights, property, children, voice. The diagnosis didn't describe a condition. It enacted a punishment. The 1853 Alleged Lunatics Friends Society was formed specifically because so many sane women had been locked away by men who found them difficult. By then, it was already an epidemic of erasure. Bertha Mason's confinement fits this pattern exactly. There's another layer to her silence. She was Creole, a woman from Jamaica, racially ambiguous in a culture that equated Englishness with rationality and otherness with savagery. Victorian medical texts explicitly linked madness to racial degeneration. The further from white English respectability you were, the more your emotions, your sexuality, your very being could be pathologized. Bertha's foreignness made her diagnosis easier to justify. Her difference became evidence. Her rage became proof. The tragedy isn't simply that she was locked in an attic. The tragedy is that she was never allowed to define her own experience. Every word spoken about her came from someone else's mouth. Every description of her condition served someone else's account. She became a character in Rochester's story, a symbol in Jane Eyre's Bildungsroman, a Gothic device in Bronte's novel. She was never allowed to be the subject of her own life. The lecture you're about to hear has been reconstructed from recorded testimony, stories, and documented actions attributed to Bertha Mason, a woman who understood that madness, as it was deployed against women like her, was not a medical reality, but a strategy. No verified record exists of this lecture being delivered publicly. The reconstruction presented here is based on documented speech patterns, recorded behavior, and witness testimony attributed to Bertha Mason by primary observers. It draws from the silences in Bronte's text, from the historical realities of women's confinement, from the questions her existence forces us to ask. Her argument is this: that confinement created the very symptoms it claimed to treat, that the label of insanity was a tool of control, a way to silence voices that threaten the social order, that her so-called madness, her rage, her resistance, her refusal to disappear quietly, was the only means of resistance left to her. the purpose of preservation is analytical. Bertha Mason represents not the terror of inherited degeneracy, but the terror of erasure. She demonstrates what occurs when diagnosis becomes a weapon, when confinement is justified as care, when a woman's own account of her experience is declared inadmissible. Her lecture is titled On Madness, Confinement, and Silencing. Playback begins now.
I was not mad when they locked the door. Let us begin there, with that fact, with that clarity. Because everything that follows, every account you have heard, every description of my condition, every justification for what was done to me, depends on you believing otherwise. Depends on you accepting that the cage was necessary. They claimed the diagnosis preceded my confinement. I maintained the confinement, made the diagnosis inevitable, that I was already lost when they brought me to that room. But I was not. I was inconvenient. I was foreign. I was angry. I was a wife who would not behave. As quietly as was expected of me. But I was not mad. The madness came after. My name is Bertha Mason, though that name has been so thoroughly annexed by other people's stories that I hardly recognize it as my own. You know me, perhaps, as the mad woman, the obstacle, the thing in the attic that prevented a love story from reaching its conclusion. You know me as I was described, as degraded, as savage, as something less than human. You have been told that my condition was hereditary, that it manifested after our marriage, that my husband had no choice but to confine me for my own protection and the safety of others. You have been told a great many things about me, none of them by me. This is not an unusual story. It is, in fact, the ordinary pattern of how madness was deployed against women in my time. A husband grows weary of his wife. She is too passionate, too willful, too aware of his excesses or his debts or his lies. He cannot divorce her. The scandal would be ruinous, the legal entanglements expensive, but he can declare her mad. He can summon a doctor who will spend 10 minutes in her presence and sign a certificate. He can lock her away in an attic or a private madhouse, and the law will not intervene. It will, in fact, protect him. Because once a woman is declared insane, she loses all legal standing. She cannot own property. She cannot make contracts. She cannot testify on her own behalf. Her voice becomes inadmissible. Her experience becomes irrelevant. The label does not describe a condition. It enacts an erasure. I want you to understand what this means in practice. When I was first brought to that room, I protested. Of course I protested. I demanded to know why I was being confined. I demanded to speak to someone in authority. I demanded my freedom. Those were rational demands, reasonable demands. The demand of a woman who understood her rights and expected them to be honored. But because I had already been declared mad, my protests were reinterpreted. My anger became evidence of mania. My demands became delusions. My insistence on my own rationality became proof of my irrationality. The very act of defending myself was used against me. Every word I spoke was transmuted by the alchemy of diagnosis into a symptom. Do you see the trap? Once you're named mad, everything you do confirms it. Silence is catatonia. Speech is raving. Compliance is docility. Resistance is violence. There's no action you can take. No word you can speak that will not be used as evidence of the condition that justified your confinement in the first place. The diagnosis creates the reality it claims to describe. And so I learn, as all confined women learn, that there's no arguing with a locked door, no reasoning with a keeper who has been paid to ignore your reasoning, no appealing to an arrangement that has already determined you're incapable of appeal. I learned that my husband's account of me, his story of my degeneracy, my hereditary taint, my unsuitability for English society, would be believed absolutely, while my own account would be dismissed as the ravings of a diseased mind. I learned that I had been written out of my own story, that I had become a character in someone else's account, and that the role I had been assigned was not a protagonist, not even antagonist, but obstacle, mad woman, monster, the thing that must be locked away so that other people's lives can proceed unimpeded. This is what I mean by making madness a weapon for silencing, the power to define someone else's reality, to name their experience in terms that serve your purposes rather than theirs, to make your account the authoritative account, the only account that matters. My husband did not need to kill me. He only needed to make it impossible for anyone to believe me. The diagnosis accomplished that. The locked door made it permanent. But here is what they did not anticipate. That confinement, while it silences, also clarifies that the woman locked in the attic has time to think, to observe, to understand exactly what has been done to her and why. They took my freedom, my name, my story, but they could not take my capacity to discern the meaning of my own erasure. And so I offer you this, a philosophy born of confinement, a testimony from the space where voice is not permitted, an argument about madness, not as medical fact, but as strategy, a tool wielded by those who have the power to name against those who have been forbidden to speak. Let us examine then what happens when the madness they created becomes the only form of resistance available. There is a peculiar freedom that comes with being declared irredeemable. When they locked that door, they believed they were containing a threat. What they actually did was release me from the obligation to be good, to be quiet, to perform the elaborate theater of feminine respectability that had governed every moment of my life before that room. They had already decided I was mad. Very well. If I was to be called mad regardless of what I did, then what I did no longer mattered in the way it once had. The judgment had been rendered. The sentence passed. I was free to act. This is the paradox they never understood, that the label they used to control me became the very thing that made control impossible. Let me be clear. I'm not speaking of the madness they described, the hereditary taint, the degeneration of blood, the inevitable decline, and the animalism that my husband cited as both explanation and excuse. That madness was their fiction, a story they told to make my confinement seem like mercy rather than cruelty. I am speaking of something else entirely. I am speaking of the madness I chose, the rage I cultivated, the refusal I enacted. Because here is what I learned in that attic, that anger, when you have been stripped of every other form of power, becomes its own kind of power. That destruction, when you have been forbidden creation, becomes a form of speech. That the woman who tears and burns and refuses to be silent is not succumbing to madness. She is deploying it purposefully, deliberately, as the only weapon she has left. They want me docile. I became fire. Consider what they called my symptoms. The violence, the attempts to harm. These were not, as they claimed, the random eruption of a diseased mind. They were targeted, specific. I knew exactly what I was doing and why. When I destroyed the thing that symbolized the future they were trying to build without me, the delicate fabric of another woman's claim to what had been mine, I was not acting in delirium. I was making a statement. I was saying, you cannot erase me and expect no consequences. You cannot replace me and expect me to accept replacement quietly. You cannot lock me away and expect the locked away woman to remain invisible. I made myself visible. Through rage, through resistance, through the very madness they had named. And when I set fire to the structure that had become my prison, I was not destroying randomly. I was refusing the terms of my confinement. I was saying, if I cannot leave this place, then this place cannot stand. If I'm to be consumed, then let everything be consumed. Let the house that held me burn. Let the man who imprisoned me face what he created. This was not madness. This was logic. The inexorable logic of a woman who had been given no other options. But they could not see it that way. To see it that way would be to acknowledge that my actions were responses, rational responses to an irrational order. It would be to admit that the madness was not in me, but in the world that required my confinement. So instead, they called it proof. Proof of my condition. Proof that a locked door had been necessary all along. My resistance became evidence of the very thing I was resisting. Do you see how perfectly the trap was constructed? If I had remained silent and compliant, I would have been forgotten entirely. A woman who disappeared into an attic and ceased to matter. But when I refused to disappear, when I made noise and broke things and demanded to be reckoned with, I confirmed their diagnosis. Either way, I lost. Either way, the version remained theirs. Except for this, I knew what I was doing. And that knowledge, that consciousness, that deliberate choice to wield the madness they had attributed to me, that was mine. They could not take it from me. They could call it disease, but I knew it was defiance. They could call it degeneration, but I knew it was refusal. They could call it proof of my unfitness, but I knew it was the sanest response available to a woman in an insane situation. Because let us speak plainly about sanity. What is sanity in a world where a man can imprison his wife for years and be called compassionate? Where a woman can be stripped of all legal rights and be told it is for her own protection? Where rage at injustice is called illness and compliance with cruelty is called health? If that is sanity, then I wanted no part of it. I chose the madness that let me fight back. I chose the madness that refused to pretend everything was acceptable. I chose the madness that said, I will not go quietly. I will not make this easy for you. I will not perform gratitude for my own erasure. And here's what they could not forgive, that even in confinement, even labeled and locked away, I had more power than they wanted me to have. The power to disrupt, to frighten, to remind everyone in that house that I was still there, still alive, still refusing to be the convenient ghost they wanted me to become. There was another woman, you understand, the one who came after, the one who was offered everything I had been denied. A freedom, respect, the illusion of choice. The good woman, the English woman, the woman who could be loved because she knew how to be small enough, quiet enough, grateful enough. She walked through that house as though it were hers. She prepared to wear the symbols of a role I still occupied. She was the future they wanted. I was the past they were trying to bury, but she could only exist because I had been locked away. Her goodness required my badness. Her sanity required my madness. Her legitimacy required my erasure. She was not my opposite. She was my replacement. Here's the deepest violence. Not that I was locked in an attic, but that I was locked out of my own story. Every account of my life, every description of my character, my condition, my history, came from someone else's mouth. My husband spoke. The governess observed. The story itself interpreted. But I was never allowed to speak for myself. Do you understand what this means? It means that I exist in your imagination only as others have constructed me. This is control in its purest form, not the power. To imprison the body, though that power is considerable. But the power to imprison meaning itself. To determine not just what happens to someone, but what their experience means. To speak for them, to speak about them. To make your account the only account that matters. And here is the final paradox, the one that brings us full circle. That this knowledge, this clarity, this truth cannot be spoken in the language of those who locked me away. It cannot be accommodated by the story that requires my silence. It can only be spoken from the position I occupy. Outside. Condemned. Already lost. So, when I set fire to that house, I was not acting in madness. I was acting from clarity. If this is the machinery, then let the machinery burn. If this is a structure, then let the structure fall. If this is a story, then let the story be consumed. I was not trying to be believed. I was not trying to be understood. I was not trying to make my action acceptable. I was simply refusing the terms of my confinement, refusing the version that had been imposed upon me, refusing to disappear quietly so that other people's stories could proceed uninterrupted. They wanted me silent. They wanted me forgotten. They wanted me to be nothing more than a cautionary tale. A Gothic device, a problem solved by my own convenient death. But I'm still here, still speaking, still refusing to be only what they needed me to be. And that refusal, that voice from the space where voice is not supposed to exist. That is my legacy, not the madness they attributed to me, not the monstrosity they described, but the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. This is what I learned in my confinement. This is what I offer from my silence. This is a lecture they never want me to deliver.
The recording ends here. What follows is a contextual note drawn from the surviving record. That was Bertha Mason. Or rather, that was what Bertha Mason might have said if anyone had thought to listen. The primary text, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, published 1847, contains no record of Bertha Mason delivering testimony in her own voice. The documented version describes the following. On the night she set fire to Thornfield Hall, Bertha climbed to the roof. Rochester attempted to reach her. She stood at the edge, and then, in Jane Eyre's account, because even Bertha's death is narrated by another witness, she jumped. Or fell. The text remains ambiguous on this point. The result, however, is documented. Bertha Mason died. The obstacle was removed. The story could proceed to its conclusion. For over a century, this account remained largely uncontested in critical discourse. Bertha functioned as a plot mechanism, Gothic atmosphere device. Early critical commentary referenced her primarily as evidence of Bronte's skill in creating suspense. The madwoman in the attic interpreted a symbol of repressed passion, of emotional excess, of obstacles the Victorian heroine must overcome to achieve selfhood. The scholarly record indicates a shift beginning in the 1970s. Feminist literary criticism began documenting alternative interpretive frameworks. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubart's The Madwoman in the Attic, published in 1979, repositioned Bertha's confinement as central metaphor, arguing that she represented the rage and rebellion Victorian women writers were required to suppress in order to achieve publication and cultural acceptance. The documented analysis reframed Bertha, not obstacle, but double, not monster, but mirror, the aspect of female experience and of women's writing that required containment for the acceptable self to emerge. Post-colonial criticism expanded this framework further. Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, published in 1966, provided Bertha with documented backstory, a name, Antoinette, a childhood in Jamaica, a perspective on colonial displacement, and the experience of being brought to England and diagnosed as mad. Gayatri Spivak's essay, Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism, documented how Bertha's Creole identity and colonial origins rendered her erasure not solely gendered, but racialized. The analysis demonstrated how Jane Eyre's narrative of feminist awakening was constructed upon the silencing of a woman of color, how imperial violence was domesticated, relocated to the English household, confined to the attic. Recent scholarship has documented additional layers. Medical historians have examined the legal and institutional frameworks that enabled Bertha's imprisonment. The documented evidence demonstrates how diagnosis functioned as instrument of patriarchal and colonial control. Contemporary criticism treats Bertha not as literary symbol, but as subject, someone whose experience, though fictional, corresponds to documented historical patterns. Real women confined, real voices systematically silenced. The critical record reveals a documented paradox. Bertha's textual erasure eventually amplified her presence in scholarly discourse. Her silence in the novel became conspicuous enough to demand explanation. Her absence generated interpretive pressure. Her voicelessness became a question of successive generations of readers documenting and attempting to answer it. What would she have said? What was her story? Who was she before confinement? The reconstruction you've just heard represents one response to that documented question. It is interpretive, yes, speculative. We possess no verified record of what Bertha Mason would have said because Charlotte Bronte provided no such testimony. But the scholarly method involves examining silences, reading gaps, asking what truths might exist in spaces where voice was systematically forbidden. The mechanisms Bertha's reconstructed testimony describes, how diagnosis silences, how confinement is justified as therapeutic care, how narrative authority determines whose experience is classified as credible. These patterns remain documented in contemporary practice. The historical record demonstrates continuity. Certain voices continue to be dismissed as irrational. Certain experiences continue to be pathologized rather than believed. The power to define another person's reality continues to function as an instrument of control. Contemporary documentation shows persistent patterns. Women who express anger, who speak consistently from their own perspective, continue to be labeled hysterical. Marginalized populations who name systemic oppression continue to be accused of divisiveness. Medical and psychological terminology continues to be deployed to delegitimize experiences that challenge existing power structures. The question Bertha's case raises, who's permitted to speak, who's believed, who possesses authority to narrate their own experience, remains unresolved in the documented record. It continues to be contested. The voices from institutional margins, from spaces of confinement, the voices classified as too mad or too angry or too dangerous to warrant serious consideration. The historical record suggests these are frequently the voices articulating truths that centralized power cannot accommodate. Bertha Mason died on the roof of Thornfield Hall in 1847, but the documented critical discourse surrounding her voice, reconstructed, reclaimed, reinterpreted, has expanded continuously since. Not because textual erasure can be undone, but because scholarly practice can refuse to accept it as final. The archival imperative insists the woman in the attic possessed a perspective worth documenting. Her experience merited preservation. Her story deserved reconstruction on terms that centered her subjectivity. This is the function of ghost lectures. We preserve voices that were routinely denied. We reconstruct testimony that was never permitted to be delivered. We examine silences and document what they might have contained. Bertha Mason's reconstructed lecture on madness and silencing serves a dual archival purpose. First, documentation of how easily voice can be extracted, how rapidly a person can be transformed into a character in another's narrative. Second, preservation of knowledge from institutional margins, truths that can only be articulated from outside acceptable discourse. The documented pattern suggests the woman in the attic possessed clearer sight than anyone in the drawing room. The archival record recommends attention. Ghost Lectures, Voices from Gothic Literature, is written and narrated by Danielle Christmas and produced by Audio Ellis. If you enjoyed this lecture, consider subscribing and sharing the recording with another lover of Gothic literature. Additional lectures will be released as new materials are recovered.